Money Makes the World, Steger, Chapter 3, The Economic and Technological Dimensions of Globalization. Okay, so in this lecture, I will be discussing Chapter 3 of the Steger as he talks about two very specific aspects of globalization, as he says, the economic and technological. The best way I think to go through this chapter is to look at what I believe are some of the key terms and concepts that he talks about. The first one, global north versus global south, is something that he doesn't actually define within the chapter, but it is important for us to understand so we know what he's talking about. He does talk about the following 5 other topics, though: economic globalization, neoliberalism, the internationalization of trade and the unleashing of global financial flows, transnational corporations, and finally, the G20. So let's begin then with this idea of North versus South, global style. The global North is a term, and global South are terms that he uses throughout to describe the different types of countries in the world. The global North refers to what we can call the developed world. That is, economically advantaged countries, mostly in the Northern Hemisphere. The other term, global South, is used to describe at one point what we call the developing world. That is economically disadvantaged countries, which mostly in the Southern Hemisphere. It's what we used to call the third world. And because of sort of the pejorative connotations around third world, global South has become the more accepted term to describe these countries where the GDP, where economic growth, where wealth and prosperity is not the same as countries in the global North, such as the United States and Europe and places like that. Okay? So it refers to the different parts of the world in terms of their economic development. All right. So what is economic globalization? That's actually what Steger begins with. And again, his definitions are useful, but also very general and sometimes kind of abstract. First of all, he explains economic globalization as the intensification and stretching of economic connections across the globe. So that means they become more, there's more of them, and they extend further, intensification and stretching. Moreover, he points out that economic globalization involves gigantic flows of capital mediated by digital technology and standardized means of transportation, which have stimulated trades in goods and services. So it is about trade on a lot of levels. And one of his most important points here is that he claims it is difficult to disentangle any discussion of economic globalization from its technological aspects. So that's why he puts economic and technological globalization together. Okay. All right. So the most important thing I think that he wants to talk about is the emergence of what he calls the global economic order. In other words, that point where the world is seen as being connected economically. And he traces this back to one specific historical moment, what is known as the Bretton Woods Conference. He also calls it the regime in 1944 in the United States, this little town called Bretton Woods, somewhere back east. You can look it up. Anyway, so what happened in Bretton Woods is very important because all these countries got together. And what they did was they agreed to reverse their protectionist policy. And they also agreed to establish binding rules on international economic activities. In other words, this group of guys, they got together and they created rules for international trade and say, hey, we're going to do this international trade thing. We're going to do it together, but here are a bunch of rules for us so we don't screw each other up, basically. One of the most other important things that come out of Bretton Woods, besides this sort of nebulous creation of this global economic order, is the creation of what he calls three new international economic organizations: the International Monetary Fund, the precursor of what would become the World Bank, and finally the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, that eventually becomes the World Trade Organization. If you're involved in economics, if you follow the news, you probably have heard of all three of these organizations at one point or another referred to. And this is when they started back in 1944 with the Bretton Woods regime. And so the other thing that to point out is he calls this the golden age of controlled capitalism. That is, it is state interventionism proposed by John Maynard Keynes, the economist. So it is capitalism, but it is capitalism under control by the state. So the state regulates and sets up boundaries and guidelines and rules and regulations in order for capitalism, this world capitalism, to develop. However, something happens in the 80s, specifically the 1980s, with British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and US President Ronald Reagan. Guess I need to explain those now, where we have something which he calls the neoliberal revolution. Viva la revolution! Anyway, the big difference here is there's this releasing of private economic activity from state control, and the promise is that it would provide a tremendous lift to world trade, investment, and living standards. And so what happens with Thatcher, with Reagan, is you have a political agenda aimed at the liberation and deregulation of state-regulated economies. So in the 40 years previous to the 1980s, from the Bretton Woods Conference to, again, this point, you had kind of these tight state controls on capitalism. But now, since Steger goes over several reasons why people were thinking that wasn't working anymore, so you had this, what he calls this neoliberal revolution, where they changed the thinking about how capitalism should be engaged in trade. And so you have this deregulation. The state, in other words, is loosening its control of capitalism and letting companies and other entities take the lead in terms of how capitalism and how trade is conducted on a worldwide scale. Well, so what does that mean? What does neoliberal mean? Well, it ends up being, and this is what Steger does really well, he ends up explaining what the neoliberal revolution involved by showing concrete neoliberal measures. So I want to be clear. We are living, in essence, in a neoliberal world. In other words, the way trade is conducted, the way things are done now, is a reflection of these beliefs, of this neoliberal ideology in terms of world trade and the world economic order. So what are these concrete neoliberal measures? So he lists 10. And you look at them, it talks about privatization of public enterprises, deregulation of the economy, liberalization of trade and industry, massive tax cuts, monetarist measures to keep inflation in check, even at the risk of increasing unemployment, strict control on organized labor, reduction of public expenditures, particularly social spending, downsizing of government, expansion of international markets, and the removal of controls on global financial flows. So basically what neoliberalism boils down to is the state does less, private entities do more. And actually one of the best examples of neoliberalism, at least in movies, is from the 80s, and it's the movie Robocop. Because in Robocop, basically OCP wants to take over the police force, which has otherwise been a state-run organization, right? It's the state who is responsible for protecting its citizens. But OCP says, nah, we want to run it. We think we can do a better job because we developed this thing called Robocop. And so the struggle of the movie is actually the privatization of the police force. And so that is basically what neoliberalism tries to do. Take previously public things and give them to private industry, because the argument is private industry will be able to innovate and do it cheaper and do it better. Whether or not you believe that's true is entirely up to you. And I'm not getting into that debate. But what I'm doing is presenting what neoliberalism is about. Really should have just put a picture of Robocop there. I'll do that later. Okay, so The other thing that, of course, he talks about is this internationalization of trade. And this is all connected to these neoliberal philosophy and those measures that we talked about in the previous slide. But it's the internationalization of trade, where you can see in 1947, there was $57 billion in international trade, but in 2021, you have $28.5 trillion in national trade. If you don't know what that comparison is, Steger does a really good job of explaining the difference between million, billion, and trillion. And you can see that the 28.5 trillion is a tremendously huge order of magnitude increase over 57 billion. And as he points out, it is dramatic advances in shipping technology that has proved to be one of the key factors in the globalization of trade. And he spends a lot of time talking about containers and container ships. He also points out that there has been the elimination or reduction of existing trade barriers among nations. And the whole argument is that it would increase global wealth and enhance consumer choice, which are, without doubt, things that have happened. People, the middle class, maybe have felt like they've gotten richer, but you definitely have more items to choose from in a way, right? You go to the store, all that stuff out there is what we would call that enhanced consumer choice. However, Steger also points out that the benefits of neoliberal globalization accrue disproportionately at the top. In other words, the rich tend to get richer, and then wealth begins to concentrate at the top of the economic ladder instead of being spread throughout. And so what happens is this unleashing of global financial flows goes along with that internationalization of trade, but also it's a different category in a lot of ways, because global financial flows has to do with the way money is moved and spent around the world. As he points out, the deregulation of interest rate, the removal of credit controls, the privatization of government-owned banks and financial institutions, and the explosive growth of investment banking is another aspect of the type of economic globalization he's talked about in the last 40 years. He also points out that all of these changes that let money flow more freely across international boundaries culminated in the global meltdown, global economic meltdown. First in 1997-98, where you had this Asian economic crisis, but more recently in 2008, when you had the global financial crisis, what he called the GFC, right? Where the world there was a worldwide recession, and it was largely due to these global financial flows that were unregulated because of these beliefs that you can increase wealth by letting money flow more freely. But as he explains, people didn't exactly spend it the way that everyone thought they would. You can read a little bit about more in Steger, where he gets into the weeds about that. But so along with all of this stuff, you have the rise in power of TNCs, transnational corporations, and these are his last 2 points. So transnational corporations in the neoliberal world have become much more powerful. He defines what a transnational corporation is: a parent company and subsidiary units in more than one country, all of which operate a coherent system of decision-making and a common strategy. So he points to like the alcohol industry, where you have that giant, basically alcohol conglomerate that has bought up all these other smaller companies. He talks about Nutella. And you could also think about our media companies, such as something like Disney, for example. He points out that TNCs are now rivaling nation states in their economic power. They control much of the world's investment capital, technology, and access to international markets. And they also have what he calls a largely deregulated labor market. In other words, there's an availability of cheap labor, resources, and favorable production conditions in the global South, which has enhanced corporate mobility and profitability. in a way, he's saying because you have these cheap labor markets in the global south, in those countries, those developing countries, transnational corporations have managed to make more money and to expand because of this availability. And again, I want you to think about what are some specific examples of how we see that happening. I won't get into them here, but this is something that we could think about and discuss for later discussion, because this difference between the power of transnational corporations versus labor, specifically people who work and make stuff, is going to be very important, especially when we look at folding Beijing. All right, the last thing that Steger talks about is the G20. What is the G20? Well, as he points out, it's perhaps the most influential global economic forum in the world today, and it is composed of the 20 most powerful national economies, representing, as he points out, 80% of the world GDP, 80% of the world wealth, but only 60% of the world population. So in other words, the top 20 national economies, that is countries, so like the United States, China, I think China's in the G20, Great Britain, all these sort of European global north countries, they have 80% of the wealth, but only 60% of the population. So this is that sort of concentration of wealth on the top that he talks about in terms of neoliberalism. So he points out that the G20 operates from this privileged position of making and enforcing the rules of global economy that is sustained by significant power differentials between the global north and the global south. So even like I pointed out, even though he doesn't define global north and global south, he assumes you already know what those mean, it is important to see that it is key to understanding how the G20 works. As he points out, the G20 makes rules because they have more power over the global south. And so they are able to make rules of economic trade that benefit the global north. As he points out, they have largely supported neoliberal interests to integrate and deregulate markets around the world. And so with that final thought, okay, a little bit more. So basically what he's saying is the G20 now operates in such a way to support the power of these transnational corporations, which are built around this neoliberal ideology of how money and capital and trade should be conducted around the world. And according to Steger, that has resulted in this concentration of wealth at the top and not spread it out evenly among all the people of the world. So we're talking about a very large scale here, but we are also talking about this very specific world that we currently live in. Steger, of course, ends by pointing out that economic and technological globalization isn't the whole point, and that there's also political globalization, and we're going to talk about cultural globalization, but that's a lecture for the other time. And so that wraps up this discussion of Chapter 3 of Steger, and thank you for stopping by.